I was taking a walk along an isolated area of beach. The place wasn't easy to get to. In fact, you nearly had to break your neck, sliding down steep slopes that weren't exactly safe. You couldn't stand up without falling. That's just how sharp-angled they were. The beach itself was much more less hospitable, the sand being mixed with lots of sharp rocks, and jagged ones too, jutting out of the water that threatened to impale any would-be swimmers that carelessly jump into the water. If there any is such thing as a truly wild beach, this was it. It did seem like the perfect place for me to go away by myself and gather my thoughts and feelings in isolation. But I did recall seeing a peculiar shape moving throughout the water. My first instinct was to think it was a crocodile or an alligator, posing as a dead log perhaps, but there was just too much fluid motion for it to be any sort of reptile. There was too much hair. In fact, it was hard to tell if it was some sort of animal trying to be a dead log, or if it was a dead log trying to be some sort of animal. It came closer and closer into the shallows when it finally began to look and emerge something from out of the water. I thought for sure I was looking at some sort of wolf that had a terribly rough time in the wild, because this thing looked rugged. Then its body was visible. I thought that its forelegs were unusually well built and long, but that's when I noticed that they ended in appendages that resembled hands far more than paws. As if this couldn't get any more bizarre, the animal kept rising up out of the water, as if it were walking on its hind legs. Actually, that's what it was doing. It shook itself violently to expel the water that had been logged in its thick, nasty matted fur. Some of the spring water, the smell reaching near me. Rank and musty smelling. It turned what I would call an intelligent presence on me, as I now realized it was aware of me. Now, you want to talk about a scrambling fool. The hillside that deposited me on the wild beach, though it was nearly sheer, I still scrambled up it for all I was worth, for my life. You can tell that I'm not exactly a survivalist, because I took no measures to make sure that thing was either staying put behind or coming after me. I blindly ran like a panicked rabbit, which is a huge 101 no-no. You are to never run from a predator. But hell, I had no idea exactly what I was dealing with. The thing didn't seem to think I was interesting enough to pursue. Fortunately, that thing didn't seem to think I was interesting enough to pursue, which is a good thing. Who knows if I would have lived. Oh, and to add in some extra detail that I might have forgotten. This happened along the Gulf Coast. I won't mention what state, but I had thick forest and everglades near me, where this thing was right next to. The area of beach I was on isn't exactly a touristy beach, but the spot I was at is very warm, very coastal, so it's not like I was at some big tourist beach town. My speculation is that I must have just been there at the wrong moment, when whatever this animal was coming out of the water to walk back into the thick swamps and trees. I must have just been there at the time to see it, and it having seen me, which is why I think it froze up. I don't believe it was expecting to see me there, and probably unsure of what to do. We nicknamed my black lab Sally, the escape artist, because no matter how we tied her, no matter what we attached her to, she always seemed to find a way of getting loose. The times that a line seemed to hold her, we would joke that she was just allowing herself to be held, that she could really escape anytime she really wanted to. That mostly turned out to be true. It was one of those things that didn't seem to be of any consequence until me and my parents went camping. We went before the weather got too hot, so it would have been around April or May. We took the dog with us, because when the family goes camping, family does include animals. I got my own tent, and Sally was just going to sleep outside of it. I had her leash on, that would be anchored to a simple stake. The sort of thing that seemed to hold well enough, until she decided she wanted to get away badly. I didn't have any major concerns at the time, but things changed that night. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard some major movement outside. With a large black lab like Sally nearby, I wasn't terribly concerned, but I couldn't shake this feeling that there was something that would make my hair stand on end, if only I could actually see it. I unzipped a chink of my tent's door so that I could look outside and get a clear look. To my surprise, Sally was standing on all fours, and she was still as a statue. And there were several points of light that it didn't seem quite right in the distance, and the reason turned out to be because, well, those lights were a set of eyes. There were several things out there that had glowing amber or bronze-hued eyes. Whatever they were, they seemed to be locked in a staring contest with my animal. At length, one of the sets of eyes came close. So close that I could make out the features of the thing, and it was a terrifying sight. I had grown up on a steady diet of pulp horror comics, and that was the incarnation of every illustration of werewolf that I'd ever seen. Except it was real, and it was downright terrifying. Even recalling the memory is kind of hard. It became clear that it had no interest in me. It was really interested in my dog. It came so close to my dog in my tent that I could smell the rancid fur, sweaty and musky, and even tinged with some of the smell of wet dog. It would get so close that it was within striking distance of my poor dog, and Sally was shivering like a leaf. But then, the wolf monster would go back up, and it would walk backwards until it disappeared in the mists. Then, it would come forward again, and come close enough to bump noses with my dog. Also close enough for me to hear its ragged breathing, like a snarl was locked up in its throat, waiting to come out. And then it would back up again. It dawned on me what it was doing. It was trying to get Sally to follow it. Sally must have gotten the memo, because I heard the sound of the earth as the stake that was holding her leash became easily wrestled free. She followed it off with the other glowing pairs of eyes that were veiled in the mists. I was utterly beside myself with panic, but I didn't even bother to move or do anything to alert the monsters. My parents didn't really buy my story as to what I had seen, but they did believe that Sally had run off after something. They said that maybe it was just a squirrel. But what kind of squirrel stands that tall, puts off an aroma that bad, and has eyes that put off light like that? Within the same year, I caught a glimpse of several unusual shapes moving in a nearby woodland, or I thought I saw some wolvish humanoid shape, only with a much smaller, more natural shape of a dog beside it. I had no way of knowing for sure if it was the same monster that had taken my dog, or if that was even my dog with it. I wanted to say to this day that it was merely an invitation, or they could have possibly pulled Sally away to turn her and eat her. I have no idea. Again, writing this to you is kind of hard to do, but I know it's probably for the better. I was hiking out in Northern California, in one of the many redwood forests, just a few hours before sundown, so the sun was riding either low in the sky and casting shadows in between the trees. I didn't want to admit that I was lost, but I was by myself at the time, so there was nobody to admit anything to. It had been largely silent, minus the ambiance of the insects and birds that were winding down for the day. Something, like a scream, pierced my concentration. It was distant, and I could not tell if it was the sound of an animal, or possibly a human. Regardless of its source, it was still disconcerting. I stood for a couple of minutes, trying to gather my bearings. No sooner had I begun moving again And then I heard the same scream, only this time closer, and much, much more louder. Or at least it had much more bass to it. It had the bestial intonations you would expect from an animal, and yet somehow an intelligence to it that you would expect from a human. It's the same feeling that you get when you hear a baby cry right before it learns to say its first words. I'm terrible at analogies, forgive me. It's hard to describe. I called out and responded, asking if somebody needed help. The same voice made a different kind of sound. Now what appeared to be a low moan. That's when I began to see the shape of something very tall and muscular. The exact shapes of its edges were hard to make out. But I knew that I was dealing with something unpleasant when I saw two lights of the same color, right where I should be. Feeling a wave of panic right up inside me, but trying to keep my wits about me. There was no guarantee that whatever this was had seen me. The shape moving swiftly between the trees, so I couldn't see it long enough to see if it was looking at me, or focused on something else. I couldn't even tell if it was getting nearer or further away. Deciding not to stick around and find out, grasping at the desperate chance that I was undetected, I too ran between the trees in a zigzag pattern. I couldn't tell if my own breathing or the sound of my footsteps, but I thought I could hear the sound of panting just outside the range of perception. That the panic was beginning to better me, but I couldn't afford to scream. I came over a swell of land and looked behind me at the top where it had come down from. After looking up just in time to see the head of this thing peeking over the hill, it showed me its jagged teeth, and then it was kind of smiling in a demented way. This thing was getting closer. I don't remember much after that, except that I had to run into a park ranger who was doing patrol of the trail. I had not realized just how near the edge of the forest I truly was. I must have babbled incoherently about what had happened, looking back, because he simply invited me to sit in his squad car, and at the same time, he was kind of regarding me as if I could be a possible druggie. I wasn't arrested. I was questioned and allowed free to go after I made a statement. They weren't going to let me go without that, because I was clearly agitated enough that they did believe I saw something. I think a few of them believed I saw something that wasn't human, but they weren't about to stake their jobs or reputations on agreeing with a crazed hiker who claims he saw a werewolf. And that's why I don't really venture out to the woods much anymore. Those are my hiking days, and those are long done. Now, I kind of find myself being much more of a recluse, doing anything I can to rid myself of that memory. So, in hopes of typing this up, I can finally kind of maybe therapeutically move past it.